Hey everyone, before we start this episode of the Perceptive Podcast, apparently OBS bugged out while I was recording it, and all the voice are not properly synced to the video. Unfortunately, I can't exactly do a second take of it because I found out after the recording, but just something to keep in mind for this week's show. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast. Here on Game Wisdom, we're examining the art and science of games. We have another developer interview lined up for today's show. He is a long-time returning guest. The last time we spoke was like 5 to 6 years ago. It seems like a very long time. But he is back to talk a little bit about what's going on with his studio, Samurai Punks, and their latest game that should be announced by the time you're watching this. So please welcome back to the cast, Nicholas McDonnell. How are you doing?
Hey dude, I'm good. It's a nice wet Australian morning here.
And it's going to be a very stormy, I guess, East Coast over here very soon. Maybe by the time, once we start talking, the rain may just come in and start hammering my roof.
Yeah.
But
yeah, everything's good.
But yeah, it is great to have you back on. So the last time we spoke, I think this was right around the time you were either launching or you were about to launch Screen Cheat. And that was...
Yeah, okay, so that was probably 8 to 7 years ago then, if it was around launch.
Ooh.
That's a... Time has changed. I mean, yeah, we turned 9 recently, so reflecting on just how much stuff we've done in that time is kind of wild.
Mm-hmm. Dylan, congratulations on that. But
yeah, thank you.
It is great to have you back on, Nicholas. And I think for people watching us record right now, I don't think you were on while I was recording in video. I think it was just all audio back then when we first spoke.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
So, I guess to get things started with, since this is technically your first time, I guess, here on YouTube for the people watching, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what is your background? And of course, what's happening with Samurai Punks.
Yeah, so I'm the managing director, which is kind of a meaningless term in Australia. I'm the co-founder and designer at Samurai Punk. We've been running the studio for 9 years now. We've shipped around. We're about to ship our 9th game, or about to announce our 9th game in that time. So we've done a lot of stuff with the studio. Before that, I was at university, so my entire career in the industry really has been Samurai Punk. Yeah, so people might know us for Screen Cheat, Screen Cheat Unplugged, The American Dream, Feather, or most recently Justice Sucks, Rumbo First Blood, or those are the sort of the bigger titles that we put out.
Mm-hmm. So, as we said, like the last time we spoke, this is around the time Screen Cheat was first released. I guess in terms of like how the studio has grown, like what would you say is kind of like your style or like your MO as a company?
Oh yeah, we like to say that if other developers make Kit Kats, or all developers are making different flavors of Kit Kat, Samurai Punk makes the soy sauce flavor of Kit Kat. We like to make something a little bit weird and a little bit surprising, we try to sort of bring that through in all our games.
Mm-hmm. And with your titles, again, like going from Screen Cheat to the last title, which would be Justice Sucks, I guess, how have, like, you and the company have grown? Again, you said, or we just said, like, it's been 9 years since you've got founded.
We've physically grown, the size of the studio. It's ballooned and shrunk and gone up and down a bit, but I think we're now 7 people. We had 12 full-timers getting Justice Sucks across the line. When we last spoke, there were just the 3 of us, myself, Winston, and Ellie. We've had people join and leave. We're like a company with an office. We've got overheads and boring. We have an accountant. It's a very different kind of world now. We've been robbed multiple times. As any good company should be, but by burglars, not by like cyber criminals or anything. It's just like a totally different environment to be making games in, and one of the big challenges is trying to still like balance that responsibility with trying to be creative. You you get into this business, so to speak, for like to want to be, you get into independent games to want to push boundaries and to be creative and to innovate. And it's once the realities of business can kick in, it can be a little tough to like not just make shallow, short-term, business-oriented decisions because you want to pay everyone's salaries. So that's probably been the biggest shift is maintaining that vision of creativity through as we grow as a company. So that's part of why we stayed so small as well. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like looking at Steam right now, like kind of like the release of your games. So like starting from like 2018, and that would have been the American Dream. Like your studio's been you've been doing a little bit more like rapid development and release. Because it looks like it was like about like 3 to 4 years from Screen Sheet to American Dream. What was kind of like? So I guess like to build off of that, what was it like to develop the American Dream? Because that is also I think your first VR title as well.
Yes, yeah, first and not the only, because we collaborated on another VR game, did some other VR projects as well, because we've done contract work in between all of this. The American Dream was not our longest production actually. I believe it was 2 years roughly. This Justice Sucks has now edged it out. It took 2.5 years. So the American Dream, its first VR game at the time when VR was in, I believe people refer to it as the winter of VR. Because right now we're coming into a better age for VR where like games can be successful and there's enough people out there with headsets and the hardware is a lot more accessible than it was then. So we were releasing during the Oculus Rift, Vive, PlayStation VR era. And we were late to that party as well. So we were sort of in the middle, the dip. Yeah, I mean, like, so that game took a long time because it was a different format of game. It was a narrative-heavy, scripted content-heavy, art-heavy game. We had a pretty small team. We ended up contracting quite a lot to get it done. So we like brought in a lot of people locally who just were able to like get things in and get it across the line. We worked with that was the first game we worked with like an external audio team. So we brought in our friends from A Shell in the Pit in Canada. They did all the sound and music and recording for the VO because there's a lot of VO in it. That was new as well. So like it just had compared to Screen Sheet, which was our first commercial game. So it's not second commercial game. We have a mobile game that we released before that not a lot of people know about. It was a very different project. Multiplayer arena shooter with no narrative and no scripted content and just like a sandbox environment kind of structure of game, going to a super scripted 3 to 4 hour experience in a different platform altogether. We had actually spent a long time on Screen Sheet. I think we were in development. We shipped the first version in 8 months, but after that we ported it and did updates for about 1.5 years. So that ended up being quite a long production, but you kind of get a lot of different milestones along the way. We released the PC version and then we released on the GOG version. Then we would release Xbox and PS4. And then, 4 years later, we released the Switch version, which was a remaster. And, you get a lot of little milestones and little accomplishments. But the American Dream, it was very like working on one thing for a long time. We did play tests and people loved it, but like it's still, you don't get to release it for a long time. So that scale of project was strange for us. So I guess in some ways, like going back to doing smaller stuff is a little bit closer to what we're good at and what feels more comfortable in terms of risk. Justice Sucks was long, but that game was balanced on the fact that it was a sequel to an already semi-popular smaller game. So it made sense to invest more time into it because we knew that the idea worked and we knew that people wanted more of it. So.
And what was it like working in VR? Like, did you enjoy it? Were there any interesting challenges or anything like that?
There's the physical strain of having to work in VR. At the time, a lot of the hardware was tethered. There was no wireless VR at the time, so all the testing was like on a desk with a cable connected to you. So that became quite frustrating over time. It never really got better. Like I guess it's just a limitation of the technology. That was annoying, but the upside is just like in VR, you can do things to the player, and I make it sound so bad. There's a scene in American Dream. It's pretty iconic now because there was like a TikTok that got like 10 million views. But the player is fed food off a gun, and the player has to eat it with their head, so they have to like sit up and eat the food. You can't do that in a flat screen game, and even if you do, like you script the camera so that it does that, or you force the player to do it, it does not have the same effect. VR just lets you do stuff that's immersive because it is immersive. And I think that was the reason we did that game in VR, because we were dealing with subject matter that was, people don't know, the American dream is a parody of gun culture in the US. And we wanted to really immerse the player in this fantasy world where you do everything with guns, and we wanted people to be up and close with them. We wanted to make people uncomfortable, and we wanted to sort of show this outsider perspective of like, this is how it seems to us. And even while we were working on it, like doing the research, we were like, oh wow, there are people in America who are doing wilder stuff with guns every day than we could possibly imagine with our joke game. Just the other day, I saw a video of someone driving a boat with 2 shotguns. Like they were shooting it into the water to propel. So it's like, that would have been a joke in the American dream for sure. But then the people just outdo us. And yeah, so VR has its ups and downs. I think just like the development process has gotten a lot better. I've done little projects in VR since, like on the Oculus Quest, and it's a lighter headset. It's more comfortable to wear. It's easier to deploy. It's a little bit faster to deploy too. And if you want to like just stand up in your room, and there's no cables, so it can be more comfortable to work on. And I think that's only going to get better over time as we just, developers have to work in it. So the developers demand a sort of better quality experience. It does make demoing at shows really annoying, I'll tell you that. Because we did multiple PAXs with the game, and you have to like put it on people, you got to clean it. Some people don't know how to use it, so they have to sort of be taught how to play. But I think with time, this stuff is just going to fade away, as it is just a secondary, it's another medium. People need to get literacy with it, and they need to understand how to use it. That goes for developers as well. The tools in VR got a lot better over time, and by the time we shipped, we'd already, sunk a lot of time into our sort of tooling. So yeah, if we ever went back to VR, things would be a lot smoother these days. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And I guess sticking with the American dream, obviously you said that it's built off of the how guns in America is viewed from outside the United States. What was kind of like the overall reception from it? Because I did remember like seeing a lot of people discussing it like right around launch, and of course showing off what it was all about. How did like the game like turn out, like, as feedback wise from you?
There was some issues with the game just being a bit long, but if you ignore that, the reception was like, it was a pretty good take. Like people who were like, libertarian gun nuts liked it because it was funny. Like it was a funny game, regardless of your political stance, which I think Winston, the co-director, and he wrote that game. I think he did a really good job executing on that. Like he was able to make it funny for gun owners as well. And his agenda was that he really wanted to like expose just the lunacy of the architecture of the American gun like economy, and the absurdity of it all. Like it is absurd that it is how it is, and it hasn't changed since we released that game. So the game is still really relevant today. Like people know how many deaths there are. We don't need to tell people about that. So we weren't really bringing up stuff like Americans don't need to be reminded of how many people are dying from guns every day. It's just the other stuff, like the bureaucracy, is also absurd, and that some people don't know about that, right? The fact that there's nowhere to trace guns, for example. So when people played it, they thought it was funny, and the main criticisms were just about the structure of the game, the length of it, and that was, again, I think, just chalked up to our inexperience with doing narrative, because the game was narrative heavy. So yeah, I think it turned out pretty well, all things considered. And we never received any death threats. We never received any really angry messages about us. Like the worst thing we got was some reviews that were negative, but they weren't like, I chalked this up to us to being like mostly men on the team, and mostly a white team, and like that sort of giving us a pass. But like, yeah, we weren't really targeted. I feel like if a group of women or people of color made this game, they would have been treated very poorly. But yeah, or maybe it's because we're Australian. I don't know. Like people are just like, oh, they're just having a laugh, you know. It's all right. So yeah, we came out of it okay, and the game is still sort of got this sort of cult status because it recently released on Oculus Quest and has done actually it is on track to do better on Oculus Quest than all the previous VR platforms combined. So yeah, it's had a sort of second life there, and it's being more positively received because of the Oculus Quest version. We fixed all the bugs. Sorry, I say we. The company we worked with to port it, they fixed the bugs. Want to make sure to give Knights of Unity credit. We smoothed out the experience a little bit, and I think it's just people are getting through it quicker, and the sort of overall experience is just a little bit better as a result. There's less, you know, if you play a long game and you hit a bug, you're not gonna. That's like game breaking. You're not gonna like really have a great time. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting about, I guess, like how things have grown in terms of VR. I guess with porting it to the Quest 2 and all that, like, has there been like, I guess, like making the game compatible? This is something I'm not too familiar with because I don't do too much in VR these days. Yeah. Were there any, like, I guess, major differences or anything that had to be like change or work around, bringing it to like a more modern VR platform?
The funny thing about the Quest, it's more modern in terms of its accessibility and hardware, but the actual like performance is much worse. So we had to lower the resolution of a lot of things, or lower the poly counts and lower the frame rates for Quest 2 and 1 compared to PlayStation and 5. Because even when we were targeting low-end VR back, because we were basically, PlayStation was our target spec, so as long as it was good on PlayStation, it would be fine on PC, which it was. And we made the game look pretty good on PlayStation, but the Quest version looks slightly worse. So that was just like what compromises we could make was mainly the main discussion with the company we worked with, because it was hard to tell where we could make wins since we already had optimized it quite well for PlayStation. So the hardware is basically identical in terms of interface model. The only difference is there's no cable. So, you know, but all the major platforms have two controllers, a headset with tracking. The Quest's tracking method, it doesn't really allow for like the guns to go behind you or your hands to go behind you at all. But neither did the PlayStation VR. And again, PlayStation was our target platform because that was the first one we actually received. So we designed the whole game around its limitations. Because at the time, PlayStation VR was just, they used those the Move controllers with the light sensors and the camera, and those were terrible. Like you couldn't do like two hands in front of each other because one would obfuscate the other one. And if you did this, it would be even worse because your hands now block the headset, and the headset loses tracking. So yeah, we worked around all of those limitations already, so we kind of like saved a lot of time. That like we didn't have to redesign anything, which was great. It was really like performance and visuals. We tried to get the experience as good as we could. So yeah, my hope is that just over time, the hardware maintains that accessibility, because it is so much, you know, setting up a Quest is just so much better than setting up like a PlayStation VR. Even the new PlayStation VR, it's still got a cable, you know, like that's just a big jump for some people. And if I want to play my Quest, it's just sitting on my shelf here. I can just put it on right now and just start playing, you know, like it's just gonna work. So the barrier to entry is much lower.
All right. And I guess with that, to move on to kind of like some other games that Samurai Punk worked on. So from there, you have Feather that came out in 2019. And this one looks obviously nothing like American Dream or Screen Cheat.
Yeah. So Feather is a game that I personally like. So the short story is it started as a game jam, and we were doing a jam either during American Dream's production or it was between American Dream and Screen Cheat, actually. That's when we did the game jam for it. So I think it was 2017. We had just we were either taking a break from American Dream or we just kind of started. And we did this little prototype called Fruits of a Feather, which was just this like kind of ugly game where you play as a bird and you collect fruit. It's like a collectathon on a small island, and it actually got a lot of downloads on itch, like several tens of thousands. So we were like, we just started working on American Dream, but during that production, I kept seeing the download numbers just keep coming up, and I was like, oh, I kind of need a break from this other thing because it's just like not a good fit for my creative and my like craft stance, like the way I like to work. So I was working on Feather, what became Feather. At the same time, I did that like once every week because we didn't really have anything we could promote for American Dream. So I would do live streams of me working on Feather because like that was studio promotion and it was a totally different format and it was easy to just work on it. And then over 3 years, we went from that jam version to what eventually became the first release of Feather. I think it took about 3 years. And then towards the end, we had finished American Dream, and I got a programmer or two to help get it. Like we put the online support in it very last minute, so it's a fully online game. It's always online, assuming you have a connection. It does work offline, and we did that just before ship. We did Switch ports just before ship, and then we ported it and then released it on PC and Switch in sometime in 2018. I have a studio timeline I can actually refer to. One of our artists made this. It was very helpful. 2019 release. Sorry. Yeah, this was around the time that we were also doing Screensheet Unplugged and Table of Tales. There's a lot of stuff happening in 2018 and 2019.
Mm-hmm. And with Feather, obviously being a game that is not really about combat, it's supposed to be more of a meditative, like low stress kind of design. Yep. Like looking at like, kind of like your previous games, of course, they're a lot more like action, far more frenetic. What was it kind of like to, I guess, slow down and make a game that's like quite different from your other designs?
It's just like the game. It was really relaxing. I needed something like that at the time. Like personally, that's what I needed, and unironically, working on it was equally as relaxing as playing it. So it fit my needs as a creative. And I think that kind of comes through in the game. Like occasionally people would ask if we could put like races in it or if we can put the collectibles back in because I removed the collectibles. And I was just like, no, I'm just making this thing. Like it's just a world. You just explore it. Like there's no objectives. Like it needs to be that. Otherwise it doesn't really serve that purpose for me. Like it's very selfish to make that decision. And it's not a massive game in terms of its audience, but it has actually resonated with a fairly wide crowd, and its fans are the most hardcore of any of our games fans, weirdly. Like in terms of hours played and in terms of how much they talk about it in the community. They're just really I think it just fits a little for certain people it fits a certain niche in their lifestyle, and they'll play it like once a day just for a little bit just to chill out.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like there's an interesting topic there about like kind of the market for like low stakes games like that in terms of having that game that it's not supposed to be like the hardcore gameplay, but it's supposed to be just something that you can log on like 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 5 minutes a day and just get something out of it. And we did see like a few developers kind of go with like trying to make like those Zen kind of experiences, and it does feel like almost like a different universe, especially compared to some of the games that I've been playing lately.
Well, yeah, compared to the games we make in general, it's a totally different universe.
And I guess like to keep on that for a second, because I actually did like I have a library presentation I give about kind of low stakes games and kind of like what is the appeal of them. So I kind of just want to get your thoughts as someone who obviously designed one. Like, what do you think is so appealing about like this kind of design to a specific market?
Well, yeah, Feather isn't just low stakes. There are no stakes. Like there are no stakes at all. You can't crash, can't die. If you fall into a wall too many times, the game just respawns you like just behind where you were. Like there's no penalties. There's also no state progression besides the weather changing. So sorry, I've totally gone around the question. Was it like what's the value of this game?
I guess player? What do you think it like drives like the appeal of a low stakes game?
Yeah. I think maybe it's the time. Like I don't know if you played a lot of like MMOs back in the day, or like I played a lot of WoW personally. but it was for me because Feather is multiplayer as well. I wanted a sense of connection with other people without the commitment of the raids and the dungeons and stuff, right? And the having to level up and having to fucking argue about loot. So I wanted this like relaxing, this is what it sort of developed in over time because it didn't start with multiplayer. Multiplayer kind of became, but now multiplayer is its primary focus. Like it is a social, relaxing space. So it's about discovery and exploration with no stakes. And I think people are getting older, like gamers especially, right? We're getting older. And it fits more people's lifestyles to have something that's lower commitment. There's no sense of FOMO like you get in Fortnite. And this still, I think this applies to the single player games as well, like your Animal Crossings and stuff, right? Where they try to like give you a lot of time to do things. In fact, they usually force you to do things in segmented stages because the games have like a real-time clock where you literally can only play a certain amount throughout a day, and then you lose the value of continuing to play is down. So you actually are rewarded by playing it in shorter sessions across multiple days rather than playing one long session for 2 days and then never playing again. So it's just sort of, I think it just sort of reflects the audience, the growth of audience diversity in terms of age and gender, and as opposed to just a switch that we've all flipped in our heads that, we want this now. It's like it's just like there are different people playing games now, and not just because we always knew that like mobile games and Facebook games were played by a more diverse group, but like I think it's also that Steam games and Switch games are being played by a more diverse group these days.
Yeah, man, I think, as you said, like, the diversity of the market these days is such a very, I think, understated trend of how game development has changed. Because, like, I think the ESA does their annual kind of metrics about the industry, and smartphones, mobile games, that kind of market is now the largest segment of gamers in the industry. And we do have more people who have grown up playing games on their phone, playing more casual, very pick up and play experiences, as opposed, of course, people like me who have played way too many hardcore games in the last year, let alone all throughout. And it does, I think, stand that as a developer, like, you do have to be, I think, a little bit more mindful of just like the market segment that you're trying to appeal to.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I think I just aged out of those kind of more hardcore experiences. Like, I'm working on Rhyme right now, but like it's sort of a maturity thing of just like I don't want to exclusively make that kind of game anymore. Like I have a need for this in my life. I feel like there might be other people that have this need in their life for this kind of alternate type of game. So that was why I made it in the first place. Like I said, it was really selfish to spend quite a bunch of time on this thing that potentially, like, I got a lot of backlash working on that game. A lot of people were like, why are there they got really upset that there were no objectives. It was ridiculous. But I just kind of stuck with it because I was like, well, it doesn't make sense to you because you're not working on it and it doesn't, it's not fulfilling anything in your life yet, but it might eventually. And it's for some people, it took them being like really tired at a convention and then wanting something to sit down and play that wasn't high octane, and it was like, oh, this is the balm that wakes you up or like just gives you that like breath of fresh air. So
yeah, and it is very interesting about trying to, I guess, like from a design standpoint, look at games that aren't necessarily like your cup of tea and trying to appreciate them for what they are. And like I said, like for myself, like usually low stakes stuff doesn't interest me, but again, it's about understanding why would interest someone else.
Yep.
So I think with that, to then I guess I move forward. Then we can talk a little bit about Justice Sucks, and was it Rumbo? Is that
yes? Yeah, Rumbo First Blood. Which the names are different because of a certain company that owns a certain vacuum cleaner. Anyway, we released Rumbo First Blood as part of the Humble Originals program, and it was like we made that game in 6 weeks. So if people want to know why it looks like it does or why it plays like it does, it was a really short turnaround little project. But yeah, it got pretty positive reception for what it was. The people who played it, we did like a slight polished release that we put out on Steam, and that reached a wider audience again. And we did console ports for it as well. And yeah, people liked it, but it was a really short game. Like it took about 30 minutes to beat the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
People who don't know, because it's the same. The premise is the same for Rumbo and for Justice Sucks, because Justice Sucks is a spiritual sequel to Rumbo First Blood. You are a robot vacuum cleaner on a quest for vengeance and protect his family. And that is true in both games. In Rumbo First Blood, your house is being attacked. And then Justice Sucks is sort of like a pseudo sequel where you've spent more time with your family. They're quite, you're quite attached to them. You're like the house dog, really. And they get captured and you need to go and save them. But you get punched into a TV and you need to train up and get the power to escape the TV realm to then come back and save your family from the evil corporation. It's a very silly game. But when you're making a game about a robot vacuum cleaner that's killing people, it kind of needs to be kind of silly. Yeah.
Or you go like super gritty, ultra realistic, and then you just freak everybody out.
Yeah, well, I mean, Justice Sucks is in this weird place where like it's a silly game, but there are jibs and there's a lot of blood. Because the main mechanic, or one of the core mechanics, there are multiple mechanics, is Dusty needs to drink blood in order to power up his special abilities. So he can use things in his environment like sucking and shooting knives, or little props in the environment, or using electronic gadgets in the house to hurt people or in the other rooms. And then once they've started bleeding enough, you drink their blood and then use the special powers to take out your enemies. And it's sort of like you're sort of comboing these three systems to smash people and save people.
And with Justice Sucks, Rumbo, and of course going back to the other games we talked about, a lot of the concepts you've been mentioning have come from either like game jams or like small prototypes. And I guess this is a question like I'm sure like developers or students watching this are probably thinking like, what has been like I guess like the approach to like spending time on these small projects or game jams as like a source for inspiration or for a new project?
Yeah, because actually I didn't mention this, but American Dream also kind of came out of a very rapid prototyping phase. We had an idea for American Dream way before we actually started working on it, but we got a PlayStation VR and we decided, let's just like try that thing that we've been talking about, and we did that within like 2 or 3 weeks. And I got a video of it on my phone and took it to an event to show some people. So, the approach for us is that like smaller scopes, because I think it's partly because we're a small team and we know that like we just can't work on something forever. And our environment is that we all grew up, we went to university, and then we started doing game jams, and then we started the studio. So it wasn't like there was no point where any of us worked on really big companies and really big teams and got a sense of that bigger process where you have like a big vision and then you write a document and then you build prototypes for the different bits of that game and then you put those all together to create a vertical slice. And that takes like a year before you even start working on it. For us, it was like, what's the nugget, or like what's the core, what's the hook of the game? Spend the shortest amount of time figuring out if the hook is any good, validate that, and then if playtest it, within a few days or a few weeks at most. And then after that, we go, okay, this is cool. We should like actually keep working on this. That's really been the case for everything. And I think game jams in particular are really just an hyper condensed version of that production cycle, because it's maybe a couple of days or a week at most is what most game jams tend to be. And it's like I said, it's a condensed way to get to that nugget and get a proof of concept out that you can then playtest and say to yourself, oh yeah, this is fun, we should definitely keep working on it.
And it's always that challenge, like with a lot of like rapid prototyping and game jam titles, to kind of like get, I guess, like the feedback that you need to say whether or not you want to continue working on this or move on to the next. As you mentioned with Feather, with like when you put it up on itch, that it just rapidly got a lot of people interested in it. And I think that's a very interesting thing for developers, because we've seen, just at the time we're recording this, I recently played through Terra Nil. And Terra Nil originally started as just an itch demo. And we're seeing again, I think, that case of putting something unique out there and getting eyes on it to see whether or not there is, justification to continue developing it.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Feather, not only did it get attention, but it the feedback on it kind of pointed me in the direction that I should go in. Because I said it was a collectathon, people were saying like, "Oh, I collected some of the stuff. I couldn't find the last like 10 or 20." So, but I actually just kept playing. I like really enjoyed like flying around. I think it's just really nice. And I saw enough comments like that. I'm like, what if I could just get people to that point emotionally, like straight away? Like, or like that was the goal, right? Is get that emotional state that they're in there. I feel like people want that, right? So like, can we get them there without the collectibles, and can we push them to that stage? But yeah, I wouldn't have known that without that feedback. And American Dream, the format of the game changed after that first playtest. It started off, it was going to be a series of disconnected vignettes, kind of like Job Simulator, but we wanted to tie it. We were like, it's not as funny. It's kind of like every bit has to be like its whole narrative on its own. So we built this like plot and structure to house, like it was like the theme park ride was how we put it together. The theme park ride run by the NRA, basically. So we built that because we knew that these interconnected interstitials just wouldn't work. But we were like, what if they're all connected, and what if it's part of a broader narrative, and what if it's narrated by a dog? So yeah, all of these things, like it's like validation that there's interest, validation that it works, and like big questions that sometimes you wouldn't find out till much later. You ask them really early, and you're like, oh yeah, the game's good, but there's this problem. Okay, do we have a solution for it? And then you can rapidly test that and be like, oh yeah, that does work. Okay, we should move forward even further.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, like hearing what people like about the game is a very important point. I know it sounds very simple as we're just sitting here talking about it, but
yeah,
I'm sure you have. I know I have. I've seen plenty of games that kind of tend to struggle with that initial hook, that very simple reason as to why should someone play that game. And for a lot of the developers out there, we've seen that difference between one that it gets it right away, that you load the game up within 10 seconds, you're already into it, versus some that it just tends to kind of like meander on. Like, you can't start enjoying this game until 2 hours of tutorials or 40 minutes of video. And what you said about kind of the movement and the feel, I think that's another interesting point. So much, I think, about kind of like the popularity of some games is just about how that game feels in someone's hands. And it's oftentimes, again, what separates kind of bad, good, and amazing games. Just in terms of, if I pick up the controller or if I set my keyboard, can I figure out how this game plays and then, grow from there?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else regarding Justice Sucks.
Well, yeah. I mean, the game came out really recently, but that game had this like really interesting development cycle where, like I said, it's our first sequel ever. And we actually got to do something we don't normally get to do, which is like we did basically start from scratch in terms of the content and the production, and we were able to like fundamentally improve the gameplay so that it was actually fun and not just like a very shallow experience. So I guess I could touch on like over a year, roughly 2 years of production that I was on Justice Sucks for, because I wasn't there for the first 6 months of it. We basically tried everything to try and get that game from a like short looped shallow experience to something that you could actually replay multiple times, because our goal, like I kind of knew that like just Rumbo First Blood was very short, but like ultimately it's not very replayable either, and it's not the gameplay loop just kind of like didn't fully work. So I spent a lot of time iterating on the gameplay loop, the AI design, and because Justice Sucks is a stealth action game, so the second most important thing other than the player is the enemies. And just trying to build like a sandbox that you can play around in, and you can like violently have fun as you murder the different enemies in the game. So that was kind of one of the core things in that game's production, and that's part of why it took so long as well. Like we didn't even know we didn't know what format the game was going to take. We didn't know if it was any fun. It took a long time to get a publisher because it just wasn't fun. And we did eventually find a publisher once we sort of cracked that open a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And I guess with Seeing Which Justice Sucks, I did play a little bit of it, I think it was about a year or so ago. And it is one of those games that it's kind of designed around kind of like that short form kind of gameplay loop. That each level has a few major objectives, you go through it. And I guess with terms of playtesting or feedback on that one, did it receive any, I guess, interesting changes, or did it kind of keep within the original vision from beginning to end?
Yeah, so one of the big changes was it was actually going to be an open world sandbox game initially. So very early on, it was meant to take place in a single world with a single level with continuous objectives running as you play through. And we totally shifted it to a level based objective based format. So every time you load up a level, you are in that level with a single objective. And we changed the format. Was initially more narrative driven, where each objective was going to have a story, but then we sort of segmented it out so there are distinct story missions that are separate from distinct objective scoring missions, with the idea that oh yeah, this is one of the missions that is mostly about just getting a good score and just sort of having fun with the systems, and then this is a mission that is mostly narrative. And then we also added, and this was based on feedback, was certain mechanics in the game, cleaning up the blood. People just found that really satisfying, so we added a mode that you can play where you just clean up blood, and it was it's called Clean Up That Mess, and we made a little song to go with it. It's got a jingle, and it's called cleaning mode internally, but it's cleaning frenzy in game. And that's just trying to, because the game has a non-linear structure. So if a map has 8 levels, you only have to complete 4 or 5 of them to actually progress to the next world. So we tried to give different, because the game already has different play styles anyway. So we wanted to give you can play more stealthy, more action. You can play being really creative and using everything in your environment, or you can just use the suck and shoot, or you can just try to use abilities. So we wanted to really let players be expressive through not just how they played in each individual combat level, but how they played through the game in general. You could kind of opt out a lot of the difficult content if you want to, and still get through and still see the narrative and still get the silly cutscenes that Winston made. Because we still, it's a really strange game. And it has a lot of things for a lot of people. And we didn't want to ever lock people into a certain format of play. And I think that was one of the big things that came through playtest after playtest, was just smoothing out that curve so that people could always get to the next world and see the cutscenes and see the story.
All right. So I think with that, let's talk a little bit about what's coming next from Samurai Punk, and then I think we can begin to wrap things up, unless there's any other design topics you're interested in talking about.
We'll see what comes out of the next one.
Okay.
It's funny how it connects to the back catalog, but yeah. So we're about to announce, theoretically, unless this gets cut for some reason, we are potentially announcing a game next week called Killbug, and it is just like all of our games, had a really strange production. They didn't really fit. It doesn't fit a format, But before I go into that, just Killbug is a super fast aerial shooter where you fight endless squads of insects, and it is unlike anything else we've made before, which is consistent with everything else we've made before. That each game is unlike everything else we've made before. Its closest analogy would be like Devil Daggers, but unlike Devil Daggers, our game is very vertical. You're shooting bugs that can climb on the wall, and the player can climb on the wall. So that results in this weird combat sandbox where enemies can kind of come at you from any angle, and the player can also just basically fly. So it's very expressive. The game has it's a score-based game, so you're competing for the global and friends leaderboards, and it doesn't have any progression mechanics, so it is very pure. That was sort of an intent from the start, was just make something that really delivers a highly refined experience without any cruft at all. And the reason it's that tight is because I was actually going to publish it on my own for a long time. So it was I produced the first playable over about 4 months. And I had, a build with the endless gameplay as it is now, the eternal mode, and it had a tutorial and options and a leaderboard, and it had all the features. I did all the music and sound myself. I did all the art and the gameplay programming. And yeah, so my intention actually was just to release that sort of January this year. But we decided, this thing's pretty good, like with a bit of, a little lick of paint, we could probably make it quite a bit better. So Samurai Punk has sort of taken it as an internal project now. And our artist has helped me sort of polish up some of the art elements of the game. Our composer has come in and redone the sound and music, and it sounds so much better. Programmers are helping me stabilize the game and also get in some more features that I just wouldn't have been able to do. And the team's helping produce like an actual marketing plan, and so hopefully it'll be more successful as a result and a better game as a result. But yeah, like that concise design, like the idea that it has no progression, no metagame, it's just like one thing, was born out of just the limitation of and my goals, because I just wanted to prove that I could ship a game on Steam that was like pretty good, and I needed to do it in a short amount of time. So the intention was just make a pretty fun shooter, and prove that, and practice Blender, So its objectives and goals and like why it exists are very different to anything we've ever done before. It was like because it was a personal project rather than a company project to start with.
And when I played it the other night, I was getting that kind of semblance of a Devil Daggers kind of score chase, but also kind of like that mix of like the push forward combat, what we see from something like a Doom Eternal and Ultra Kill, that kind of thing. That you can use your sword to regain your health. And I guess like from like as you develop Killbug out, like obviously with the Devil Dagger influence, like kind of like what did you want to take away from Devil Daggers, and what did you want to kind of I guess add or put your own mark
on? What I really liked about Devil Daggers was just how refined that core loop was. Our loop is quite a bit different because it's less bunny hopping and avoiding enemies, and more like you said, push forward. It's like the Killbug combat loop is actually very aggressive and very very little defense, very offensive. You need to kind of stay on top of enemies and keep pushing through them because we have a health system, unlike Devil Daggers. And that game is basically perfect. So like anything I say, I'm like, we didn't want to do this. It's like personal taste, because I think Devil Daggers is nearly a perfect game. What I wanted to do was sort of like flex on like the verticality and aerial maneuvers and things. So probably just spoil a bunch of stuff here. So if you want to like play it and not get spoiled on a lot of mechanics, because there are a lot of hidden mechanics in the game that you discover through play. So fair warning for this point onwards. So for example, you can discover that you can get more height by you can use the melee. So when you use the sword, you can dash, and the dash can be used in any direction. So for example, you can dash up into the sky, but you can also use the sword to bounce off the ground like a shotgun jump or a rocket jump in another game and get really high in the air, which then allows you to stay in the air longer by shooting downwards, because the gun also gives you velocity upward. So there's a bunch of tools just in the movement, right? So they let you sort of maintain that verticality over your enemies, because a lot of the enemies don't fly, they just climb on the walls. So that gives you an edge there. The wall running and wall jumping is not really limited by anything, unlike I don't know, like a Ghost Runner. So because I wanted to make you feel like a bug. So you can sort of like shimmy up walls without ever going downwards, and bounce between walls reliably, and then chain that with that air dash and with double jumping and with the gun jumping. So all of a sudden you go, as you play through the game, you're sort of discovering, oh, I'm stuck on the ground. This is just like a sort of circle strafey kind of shooter, to this like, oh no, I need to be off the ground. Another reason you probably want to be off the ground is that your gun does double damage when you're off the ground. So all of these mechanics are I'm trying to push you to sort of play a certain way, and that way will let you succeed more. Like you said, like you heal when you get kills with the sword. So the sword is also the only way you regenerate ammo with your gun properly, because your gun regenerates ammo extremely slowly. But if you hit enemies with the sword, you get your ammo back. So the goal is like get the player off the ground, get them dashing through enemies and into enemies, and make them feel like just an absolute master of their environment. Because the game is like, because it's all insect themed, the bugs are all just real bugs, except some of the later enemies. And it's kind of got this like horrorcore vibe where everything is kind of scary and gross and ugly, and oppressive. And I wanted to sort of like let the player slowly have moments where they felt like, oh, I've mastered the game and I actually can overcome these odds. Eventually you will die anyway, but initially you'll get a couple of these moments where you kind of push past those like skill gates, you discover those mechanics, and you can feel like mastery over the systems and mastery over the enemies.
And with kind of like developing the game, and again, for people watching this right now, the announcement is going to be said to come out in about a week or so from when this recording will be already been up. I guess in terms of expanding on what's there, like what are your plans in terms of after the announcement to kind of, I guess, flesh out the experience?
So I've still got a little bit of time, because we're actually, if the announcement is out, we are launching on May 4th. Well, actually, no, May 3rd American time. So very, very short turnaround. I'm mostly just polishing what's there, making sure the feedback for those systems is good, because the hidden mechanics should only be hidden in such that once you haven't noticed them, they're hidden. Once you notice them, they're not hidden. And just expanding the late game, because I've recently got access to players who are like extremely good. If you noticed the leaderboards when you played, probably there was, I think you did like 20k or 30k.
Yeah.
There's someone on there with 300,000, and I'm like, okay, there's some skill gaps to fill. So I want to get more opinions from people who are at that skill level, and I want to be like, make that experience. The early game should be good, but that late game needs to be even better, because you really need these big reveals and these big moments. So working on that is sort of where our time is going, and then just quality of life stuff, general UX. Where unlike Devil Daggers or Hyperdemon, we're going to have controller support, and we're going to try and do good Steam Deck support, but that is all like no promises, depends on how much time we get. We have such a short turnaround, we're really just trying to cram in what we can without hindering the quality of the game at all, because every feature you add or every change you make, there's a risk you actually make the game worse. So, but I've got a pretty good playtesting group that are playing, so if builds come out, we play test them thoroughly. The playtesting group gives their feedback, and we just try to make sure we're always moving towards that sort of core vision and making sure it doesn't ever regress or get worse.
And that's always a challenge with kind of like these very high skill based games in terms of, I guess, how far do you want to go with them? Like one of the things I kind of knocked me out Devil Daggers was that it just felt like the skill curve was so high that it was so specific in terms of how you had to play to win that I just kind of lost interest in playing the game at like that super optimal level.
It's not a solved problem, I don't think, because you could tell what Sorath, the developers of Devil Daggers, what they cared about when they did Hyperdemon was they weren't interested in players who are not great at the game. They were interested in giving an experience for players who are bored of Devil Daggers, who think Devil Daggers is too easy. So when they did Hyperdemon, they just totally changed the flow of that game. I guess I am trying to give a player a more expressive sequence of play and let them try. There are multiple valid strategies to succeed. What I don't know is like, okay, beyond the top end we have currently, are there multiple valid strategies to succeed beyond that top end, or is it only one strategy that actually gets you past there? But that is kind of just the mystery of this kind of game. Like when you're making a game that's driven by mastery versus driven by pure knowledge, it's just a sort of untread waters for me. So I'm curious how that plays out. But it would be an ideal scenario is that a lot of players with time can get to that point where they at least get to see everything, or they at least get to feel a sense of like growth and skill over time, rather than hitting constant skill walls, right? Though in some ways, like those skill walls are good, because what they, to counter that point, like without these distinct walls, often what we'll do is we'll add a a drop in difficulty just after that wall, so that if you can pass it, you get a moment of relief, and you can actually get quite a bit further afterwards before you hit another one of those walls. And that gives the game a good ebb and flow from repeated plays, but it also means that you can, after mastering that sequence or breaking past that wall. So, for example, the earliest bosses in Killbug are kind of one of the first skill walls. You do get to crest that hill, and you get to feel like you've beaten something rather than just being battered down by more enemies coming straight away afterwards. And it's really no different, I think, in the desired experience that you get out of something like a Dark Souls or an Elden Ring. I don't think it's for everyone, and I think that's okay. But that is definitely the desire. It's like you can't have that big relief. You can't have that big, well, at least in these kind of games, it's hard to get that sense of accomplishment without something to overcome. But as a result, you are making something that is less accessible, and you're making something that is less broad in appeal, and you just kind of have to know that going in. I think it's worse because there's multiplayer and because there's leaderboards. I think if the game was single player only, it will be a very different story, because then you could be adding tools for the player to overcome more easily, right? But it's interesting that like making it is really a multiplayer experience at the end of the day. Like you are competing against the world and your friends, and you you would sort of be compromising that experience if you added power-ups or permanent upgrades or something that let the player get past those points more easily without actually having to learn the tool. Like there are sort of tools the player learns as they play. So like if the player doesn't learn that, instead just overcomes the difficulty by powering themselves up through some upgrade tree or something, they don't quite actually gain the mastery they might need later on to get further. And that might be okay for a single player game, but in a competitive game, you kind of need to sort of maintain that integrity for it to work at all.
And as you were saying a few minutes ago, it's that challenge of just how many viable ways are there to play through the game, especially at the high end. And that was, again, one of those limitations with Devil Daggers, or, as you were just saying, any game where there are no, I guess, abstracted elements. There's no tools you're going to give the player. There's no upgrades. There's no persistence. It's basically, here's your sword, here's your gun, how long can you keep going? And like you just said, it is going to limit the game's appeal. Like anything that has a high skill level, obviously is going to have a limited appeal to it. And it's always that difficulty of how do you square that between I want to make a commercially viable game versus I want to make an incredibly difficult game.
Exactly, yeah. And just to be clear, like when we're separate, like we're adding controller support because that's accessibility. Like I want to make this game easy to play. I want it to be easy for you to pick it up. We've got really good camera options as well, because Winston, our co-founder, is like he suffers from simulation sickness, but he doesn't mind a first-person game sometimes. So we wanted to make sure he could easily play it. But yeah, like that separation of friction in the game and difficulty versus like just pure accessibility, like we made sure we solved. I think you just have to go into these kind of games knowing that it's a massive success in a game like this is very different to a massive success in a broader game, but you sort of build your budgets and you build your scope around that. Like I think it would be unwise to keep the game this difficult and then also like work on it for 3 years with a full team. Like that would probably not be a sound business decision. Because unless the game was like ascended reality and the player was just like it was just worth it for that. It's for a team of our size, it wouldn't make sense to just work on it forever. So we have to do what we do. And like I said, like I started it by myself, so it kind of made a lot of sense to do this when it was just me, because it was like a practice project. Like I wanted to prove that I could make a satisfying shooter again, because I hadn't made one really since Screen Sheet. Besides a bunch of small game jams and side projects. So executing on that was kind of pivotal.
And with the game, as you said, like with the whole recording and what's going to be happening still kind of in the air as of right now, when the game is released, or if it does get released, is it going to be going into early access, or is it just going to be 1.0?
No, the current plan is that it's going to come out 1.0 May 3rd.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason why I want to say it is like, I guess as you said, like this is meant to be like a very short-term project. How long have you actually worked on Killbug?
So I started my side of it in August, and then it came into the company production in late January.
And that will be 2022, right?
Well, the company started working on it in 2023.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was doing it in August last year. So, last year, 2022, right? People could watch this out of sync. So yeah, it's very, very short turnaround. Not as short as Rumbo First Blood, but it's much more polished than Rumbo First Blood as well. So
I guess to like build off of that, like as you said, like this was going to be like your way of trying to make another satisfying shooter. And since Screen Cheat came out, we've seen this kind of resurgence of kind of like the old arcade style, very skill demanding shooters, as I mentioned earlier with Doom Eternal, Ultra Kill, the whole boomer shooter craze. I guess how did that kind of, or how or if did it influence Killbug, or just making a shooter?
It wasn't an influence in the decision to make it. I just play a lot of shooters regardless. Like, but the ironic thing is I play a lot of like slow paced stuff usually. And I think that kind of reflects like what I actually play reflects in the pace of the game. Like Killbug is smooth. It's a fast game, but it's not fast in the way that Dusk or Ultra Kill are fast.
Mm-hmm.
It's a smooth, floaty experience like Halo. Because that's what I play. Like I play Halo Infinite and I play Hell Let Loose, which is a World War II arena thing. Well, not an arena shooter, it's a World War II like sim, basically. That's what I play when I play shooters. But the influence of boomer shooters was more the just like clever polishy stuff. So I've played Ultra Kill and Dusk and Gloomwood. Well, that's ImSim, but I've played a Medieval. This is basically just all the New Blood games. I haven't played Iron Fury yet. Played some Hellscreen recently. That's pretty cool. That just came out. And yeah, they all do little different things and they all have little tricks. And it's really, for me, it's like studying these games about like, oh, I like how they do their hit flash, or I like how they do screen shake, or I like how the camera rolls. Like Shady Knight, I played the demo of that recently. That game also looks wild. But like, I feel like Killbug is more like Shady Knight than it is like Dusk. If that makes sense. It has more in common with the game feel of that, where it's more about these like fluid movements that are interconnected rather than, because we only have one. We don't have multiple weapons or ammo. We have a sort of a player with a set of player abilities. So it's like kind of more about combos and fluid movement than it is about making sure you get the health pick up at the right time and stuff. Yeah, it is a bit weird, really. Like it's a bit of a fusion of a lot of things and a lot of things that I like, which potentially will put off a lot of people. But reception so far has been good, so regardless, I'm satisfied with it. So we'll see how the general audience feels about it.
And what you said about kind of like the fluid movement, I think that's a very interesting point. As you mentioned earlier, you played Ghost Runner, and I played that one as well, and that was a very interesting game. I think there's a difference. I'm curious what you think about this between kind of games that are, I guess, very rapid in terms of movement. Like, say we go back to like the old school Doom and the Quake, versus kind of what we see today, where the movement has to be very fluid. Like, it has to feel good. It has to feel like the player's in control of moving around. Like, say a game like a Doom Eternal or an Ultra Killer, that style of movement.
Yeah, I think the difference for me is that it's kind of like there's a continuous forward momentum that is unbroken in a successful play of Doom Eternal, or you can really see it in the way that they show their marketing material as well. Like the videos of Doom Eternal or Ghost Runner, they never move to the left or back. They never move backwards. They never move to the left or right, really. They're always like snaking through the levels in kind of like smooth curves, right? They're not strafing. Strafing is a thing for a boomer shooter. Like, so I don't know if Killbug, for example, is a boomer shooter because you don't do a lot of strafing. You also don't do a lot of snaking because it's not a linear game. It's an arena. A lot of your movements are like, I would describe them as diving in and out of enemies. You scoop through them and to get a melee hit. You turn around and start shooting them and get above them. I'm just doing all these hand signals to try and gesture it. As you you need to maneuver away from them so that you can use your gun. But then as soon as your melee comes off cooldown, because it's a dash and a melee connected, you dive back through them to try and get some health back or to do a lot of damage. And it's not quite the same as just like a game where you're sort of constantly trying to keep you want to keep the enemies at a certain distance,
Yeah.
like within a boomer shooter. Yeah. Like there isn't an ideal distance in Killbug. It's all very situational. The level design, where you are at the moment, will matter. Which enemy you're fighting will matter. The tools you're given are quite varied because the gun has a precision shot for its first bullet, but after that it spreads. So like if you want to shoot straight, you need to like let go of the gun. You need to let it stop shooting for a second. But if you spray it, you can still hit lots of enemies, but you need to be a bit closer. And then the sword is even closer than that. So it's all very situational and it's all very expressive. But yeah, definitely to your earlier point, it's true that like I wouldn't even call Doom Eternal a boomer shooter. I would call it whatever this modern FPS trend is.
Yeah.
We don't have a name for it yet.
And I think what's kind of interesting about games like Doom Eternal, Ultra Kill, and as you were describing with Killbug, is that there's a kind of higher skill curve towards mastering techniques. I think that's something that's a little bit new or newer from like the shooter side of things. Where like we go to the action genre, there have been a lot of action games released in the past 15 years that all have like those kinds of like different tiers of mastery as you learn how to string combos together, how you learn to move around and parry and dodge. And we're really just starting to, I think, get that with shooters these days. I have to ask, did you have a chance to play Roller Drone by any chance?
No, it's on my list, but I did prototype Roller Drone a long time ago. I prototyped a version of that game because it was a pitch I had. So it's the kind of game that I want to play because I'm like, mine was Jet Set Radio Future combined with shooting, so very similar because you're on roller skates in that game too. But yeah, the idea of like fluid, constant momentum, chaining combos together, yeah, it's genius. I really want to play it. There's too many games, as you know. There's just too many games. If it's not research, I can't do it on company time. So.
You're not going to find me arguing about that with too many games out. And I guess the point I wanted to get to and kind of ask you about Killbug, as you were saying earlier with having kind of like secret mechanics or the secret tech that you want the player to learn, how did you decide on, I guess, how much mastery or how many like advanced tech did you want for a game like this? Because you like with shooter or very reflex-driven games, the sky is very much a limit. You can really add in all kinds of ways to kind of reward the master, but it can oftentimes feel like you're like the second you start playing the game, you don't automatically know how to do 27 different maneuvers. You've already died. Like you're never gonna get beyond that. So like, how did you, I guess, like design or implement like how far you wanted mastery to evolve in the game?
Yeah, well, the starting thing is like the basics of the game and success in the game. You can get pretty far by just having played a shooter before because the gun does good damage, the sword does good damage on its own. You can get through the first couple of waves pretty reliably just by moving around, avoiding enemies, strafing like you would in a boomer shooter. But to actually succeed, you need to start popping some of these skills. And I tutorialize. If you play the tutorial, you notice like currently, this might change before release. Who knows? I don't teach anything except the basic inputs and wall running. My newest tutorial currently that I'm working on teaches wall running a bit more thoroughly because players are struggling with it at the moment. Like new players are struggling with it at the moment. Just to remember to do it. So I wanted to give players like the basics. I wanted to make sure they knew how to do the basics. And they could get a certain, I kind of know that everyone can kind of get to 20k, in the current points curve, which is kind of like a couple of waves in. And that will sort of be like, then they'll see the leaderboards and they'll see like people getting past that and say, okay, how do I get there? Along that way, they'll have discovered a few more things. They should have by then mastered like health and ammo. That's pretty substantial. If they can get their head around health and how to successfully get health, like, because the health system requires you to get kills with the sword, and the sword requires you to get close, right? So that hopefully teaches them that like this is not a strafing game, right? It's a game about going through enemies, like you cut lines through them, and then you come back around, like almost like a plane. And going from there, like adding more mechanics was always like, what I would do is I would just be playing and I'd be like, oh, there's this moment that I've accidentally got myself into a situation where I feel like I could do a skill shot here, or it would be nice to have a skill shot here. And I would adding things to support like more basically flashier play, but also like give the player like a damage bonus or a cooldown bonus or something for that style of play. And it was always like encouraging players to get into a certain position or to sort of play to a certain rhythm. So some of the stuff you'll do in the game is completely like, it's not surfaced like, oh, I reduced your melee cooldown by 0.2 of a second with a little UI pop-up, right? It's just like the game will just sort of feel like it's rewarding you for doing the right thing. And the limit on that I don't think exists. Like, I think if I could, as long as the mechanics don't make the player play in a way that feels like rigid and locked, I could keep adding those forever. So to your original question, like, it's like because I have been experimenting with some new skill shots. As long as they don't go like, oh, this is superior, this is dominant, I should just do this. I would add it, and I probably would never stop adding them because I think that's cool. Like, I think as long as the player gets their money's worth out of an experience and they don't feel like cheated, the game's gonna be fairly cheap anyway, so it's not really a concern. And as long as they know what they're getting into, which I think we'll make pretty clear in our marketing material that this is like not an easy game. I don't think there's an issue with giving more tools and more tools for later players, as long as they aren't like as long as it doesn't generate a dominant strategy. And if there is a dominant strategy, like, that might just be impossible to avoid at a certain point. But like, as long as for a long time players can get quite a varied experience out of it and try different things and try to succeed and try to strategize and try to win, that's cool, I think.
And like having like those different ways, I think that's another very interesting aspect when we talk about kind of reflex-driven games. Like, again, like, I won't spoil too much on Roller Drone, but it is very much a game where they give you a lot of different ways of moving around. Like, it's not just about learning one thing, it's about how each weapon has its own like little quirk or little touch to it that can lead to more advanced strategies. I've been also, speaking about like mastery-based games, I've been playing Pizza Tower, and I've been really enjoying that one. And it is, again, one of those games where there is a fundamental difference between playing the game as, a beginner, an advanced, and then like the master or expert level. And oftentimes the challenge of these games, and I think this may be one of my final questions for you, since we're, I think, about like 75 minutes in, but I want to ask you about moving the player through mastery. Because I think this is one of those things that gets really difficult when we talk about reflex-driven games. When we talk about RPGs, abstraction, it's about learning the mechanics and the rules. When we're talking about in real time, it's that difference between, do you know how to do a single jump versus can you do a triple jump over the wall, bounce on the enemy, flip over the air, do 3 headshots, ground stomp, and then repeat that and just never touch the ground. So, in terms of like moving the player through mastery, I should say, what are your thoughts on that, like from like an onboarding or a UX perspective?
I think for me, and it's a challenge, it's the current challenge that I'm working on. I think it's like my main thing I've been doing for the last like month, since I'm more or less, some things haven't changed in a while in the game. It's a UX problem of, you might have this hidden system that you don't think is that hidden because you designed it and you implemented it and you know how to do it, right? But playtesters just don't notice it, or they do notice it and they do it by accident, but then they don't understand what happened or changed. Look, this doesn't just apply to player things. I think with a game with varied enemies have certain behaviors or ticks, and learning how to abuse them, or it's a bad word, learning how to overcome those behaviors is kind of part of how these endless games work. If the enemy has a certain weak spot, or it has a certain, it doesn't turn very fast, but it's really good at charging forward. It's a classic enemy archetype. You just got to figure that out. But if the enemy does not signal that behavior very well, the player will never really understand that. And it's often about making everything really transparent and really clear to the player, so that they can have everything at their disposal. Like, I put a lot of trust in the player. I trust the players are good and intelligent people, and that they, not even like we talk about reflexes, just like they're smart enough. As long as you give them the information, they will understand it, right? And we're not relying too much on genre convention. We're just relying on nice, like, lizard brain stuff. The player will figure out, this thing is a threat because of this thing it does. This is how I need to overcome it. It's actually weak in this context. Or this is, I should try, like, some of it is like, for example, you can reflect the projectiles the enemy shoot. Every projectile in the game can be reflected. The enemies with projectiles aren't a threat if your melee is off cooldown. That's just the fact in Killbug. But if your melee is on cooldown, they are a threat, right? And that push and pull is kind of neat. But players don't necessarily know that they can reflect projectiles in the first place. So getting them to that point is making sure that if they do it by accident, or if they try it, it's easy. Like, it's not hard to pull. It's not like, it's just knowing that they should try it in the first place. But if they try it, they do it successfully every time. There's no bugs. Like, sometimes, like, you can have a bug, a subtle bug or a subtle interface thing, and then that, like, totally throws someone off, and then they misinterpret how something works. So, for example, like, the health system in the game, the way healing is done, I keep changing how the feedback works, or like improving and adding. I keep thinking, there's got to be enough feedback on the healing now. People must understand I get health when I do this thing. But they don't. Not all players get it straight away, and they need to really have that hammered home. So I think it just applies to everything. It's like just surfacing it to the player, like really putting yourself in their perspective and just playtesting the shit out of the game. You really just need to watch people, and you need to watch them struggle and suffer and hate it. Especially if they're the kind of players who you think should be good at the game. That's the best, I think, in this mastery context. Where you find someone who's like, they should love this, like it's their game, right? And then they play it and they struggle, and then you go, okay, ask. And my strategy has really just been like, I watch them play blind, and then I ask them, like, what have you understood about the game? What have you internalized? What do you understand are the systems and rules of this world? And then I say, okay, they got 20% of the game. Let's work towards 25%, or let's work towards 30%. I don't expect you to learn everything instantly, but you should sort of, like you said, it's like that. It's not a cliff of mastery. It should be like a road. They should make little steps along the way, and they should slowly, as they play more, be like, noticing this little thing. The other night I was playing Spelunky 2, and there's turkeys in that game. Spoilers for Spelunky 2. You find the turkeys pretty quickly, but I found out you can bomb turkeys to get health. And I was like, because I knew you could set them on fire to get health, but I didn't realize the bomb did fire damage, or I didn't realize that the bomb would turn them into cooked turkeys and then let you eat them. So I'm like, this mount, which is pretty useful, is also just free health if I have a spare bomb, and that's a trade I can make, and that's an interesting thing. But like, I only noticed it because I dropped a bomb on one by accident. Like, I didn't intentionally do that. But the game is like, the game has this, like, the turkey is this sprite, and when it's edible, and when it's health, it looks like a cooked turkey, and the sprites look totally different. It's really clear. It looks like a wall chicken from Castlevania. And, there's some internal game literacy there at work, but it's just like, the art in that game is crisp, it's transparent, it's clear. Like, the state change happened instantly, and I was like, oh, okay, that's sweet. Now I know this thing. And I know why it happened, because it happened the frame that the bomb exploded. So it's just working towards that, really. Sorry, that was verbose to say, yes, the feedback should be better.
And I think you made a really good point about looking at what the market, or like the intended market, and how they are picking up on your game. Because, again, if you show your game to, let's say, a master at first-person shooters, and they're not understanding how to play it, what makes you think someone who's never touched a shooter or has very little knowledge is just going to stumble upon it and master that game? And it sounds, again, like very easy when we put it like this, but it's oftentimes very difficult to move that player through those levels. Because as another big point is how someone deals with loss. Like, there are people who, the second, a bug hits you, you're dead. They're like, well, I don't want to play this game anymore. They may have spent 45 seconds on it. And then there are people who, I died, reload, just immediately get right back to it. And it's kind of like that dichotomy that I see with a lot of the very, like, skill-intensive games. That they typically have, like, a lot of churn rate among people who play them. And then once you get to that kind of stable point where all that's left are the hardcore fans, then they're just going to do everything. Like, they're the ones who are going to stick around. But it's oftentimes, as you said, like, it's very difficult to get someone, I guess, off the ground when they're coming to this game and just not knowing, okay, what am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I think to your point about like what I took from Devil Daggers and what I didn't. This is why Killbug has health. I think that's, it's a little bit from Ultra Kill as well, right? But they have health. You have health as a bar. It can go down. Enemies do different amounts of damage. But there are ways to regenerate it that the player has full control over. Because the only way to regain health in Ultra Kill is to use the melee. And the melee is a pretty bad attack in that game. But it does also reflect projectiles, I think. It's got its use, right? It's got its very specific use. It does a little bit of damage, it reflects projectiles, but it also gets your health back. So I wanted to do the same thing where, like, it just gives the player a second chance, like, or multiple second chances in our case. You don't just die instantly, and it just lowers that chance that someone will pick it up and just die, and then be like, this is actually ridiculous. This is way too hard, So that buffers it a little bit. But even then, I think the game is just, tuning it. It's kind of like a tough challenge as well, because I could tune the difficulty down to make the onboarding ramp like smoother, instead of it being like an exponential curve, it's a logarithmic curve. But then that's going to make the game, because it's a fixed spawn rate and a fixed spawn positions and fixed spawn times, for the sake of the leaderboard consistency, I'm going to then sacrifice the experience for players who are already good, because they're going to actually want to skip those early phases. So it's tough. Like this kind of goes back to your question about like how big is the audience, and as like a market thing, like who are you targeting, and is there a big enough audience to justify a large production? I'd say no, there probably isn't. That's why we've kept it kind of tight. And just, you kind of, every decision in design is just a trade-off, right? Like you trade, if you make something really, really transparent, you trade off like elegance, and you trade off visual clarity. Like you give visual clarity, but sometimes you have to reduce like just visual appeal as a result, right?
Yep.
So in our case, it's about like making sure we're not making too many of those sacrifices whilst making it slightly more accessible. And it's tough, and that is the job, I guess. That's the hard part.
And what you just said about, is there like a market big enough to do like a full, AA, AAA version of games like this? That is a very tough question. And like 10, 15 years ago, we could say like no about roguelikes. Like there was very little in terms of roguelike design outside of traditional rogues. And that kind of shifted with the likes of Spelunky, Biome Isaac, and so on. And I mean, like, right now, like, the other big question is, I'm sure you've probably heard of Vampire Survivors at this point. And, like,
yes.
It's that very weird kind of segment of, is there a market for, is there, like, a 2 million strong market for a Vampire Survivor-like? Or is there just a market for Vampire Survivor? And it's the same thing with shooters. Is there a market for games like Doom, like Ultra Kill, like Devil Daggers, or is it just a market for those specific IPs? And it's a very tough question to answer when you're trying to figure out, like we've said, like who is the intended market for a game like this?
Yeah, I agree. And like there, it beyond just like, oh, I'm a player who likes these genres, which, you know, there are players who play certain genres. There are hooks in those games that are more subtle, and it is sometimes just like one thing that makes Devil Dagger special is the art is incredible. Like, that game looks super cool. And it looks like nothing you've ever seen before, partly because of the art direction of the assets, but then also their rendering engine. You can't replicate that. You shouldn't try. Like, that's a thing that's unique to that game. And thinking that you're going to hit the same audience as them because you have a similar game is like kind of a fallacy. Like, they have sort of a couple of bands of things making that game what it is. You know, it's interesting. Ultra Kill has done really, really well compared to, I think it's the most successful New Blood game of the stuff they've published. I can actually tell you why. Is it because it has a mix of level-based, skill-based gameplay, and it's got that Devil May Cry scoring system? Is it the art direction? Is it the soundtrack? Like, you can't say that any of that stuff for sure. You know, I think that's part of why we keep our games kind of small in scope, is because making video games is a bit of a gamble every time. Some people say you need to make 10 bets before you'll have one that does well. Samurai Punk's never really had anything that's done super well. So we're still rolling that dice every time. And as long as we're having fun and learning along the way, it's okay.
All right. So I think with that, we are about an hour and a half in. I can rant and rave about action design. I definitely want to talk with you more about that, especially after Killbug is out. I would love to hear your thoughts on Roller Drone once you get a chance to play it as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Come back, we'll talk about how Roller Drone is the best game ever made.
And Killbug is the best shooter too.
See. let the audience validate that for us.
All right. So before we kind of go into our wrap up, anything else regarding like any gameplay details of Killbug or anything like that you would like to discuss before we wrap up?
What was the URL? It's like killbuggame.com. Well, I mean, the Steam page will be up by the time we're talking in the future. So I reckon just check it out. The trailer's pretty good. Winston did a good job. Mitch did a good job with the music. Think you'll like it or you won't like it, and it's real simple. It's good. It's nice making a game. It's cut and dry. Like, and maybe if you're an arachnophobe, don't play it because there are spiders. Yeah, I think we've sort of talked about like why it's interesting. Just check it out, and you know, if you play it and you like it, leave us a review. That'll be very helpful. Yeah.
All right. So I think with that, we'll wrap things up for the show. Nicholas, it's been a pleasure catching up with you. Again, it feels like it's only been like a few years, and yet time seems to be moving ever so faster these days.
It's nearly been a decade, yes.
Oh my goodness. Don't say that anymore. I'll turn to dust as we're talking.
Yeah, it must be great. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah. And if you're free to chat again in the future, definitely reach out, and we can certainly catch up some more.
Yeah. That's awesome.
All right, so I guess my two final questions for you. First, do you have any social media links, Twitter, whatever you would like to mention?
Yeah. Just twitter.com/samuraipunk. Our TikTok is pretty good. I think we're samurai_punk there. Where, you know, you just search Samurai Punk, we're easy to find. We've been around long enough, our links all exist.
All right. And my final question then is, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching this in the future for them, present, past for us at this point, and wrap up on?
I guess thanks. Like, we wouldn't be here making games 9 years. It's been 9 years. So we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for people buying and playing our games. So yeah, thanks for giving me a career, giving my team a career, and like giving jobs to a bunch of weird Australians. Yeah.
All right. So I think that is a good point to end on. So for people watching, again, thank you for tuning in. Do all the YouTube stuff with bells and liking and all that. You'll find links to the various games from Samurai Punk and the social media down below in the recorded version. If you are a developer working on a game and you'd like to come on and talk about it, or just chat game dev, we're always looking for guests for live and recorded casts. So definitely reach out. Be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon. And come back for daily sessions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Nicholas, again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you my evening, your morning. And
Yes.
again, congratulations on the 9-year anniversary of Samurai Punk. And I hope to see more from you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been great.
All right. So, everyone, thanks again for tuning in, and see everybody next time.